Welcome to Casa Gorordo Museum.
Cacao in the 21st century. Before, in Lantoy Cave, on the highest mountain in Argao, lived Maria Cacao.
Casa Gorordo Museum is a centerpiece project of the Culture and Heritage Focus Area of the Ramon Aboitiz Foundation Incorporated. The museum's mission is to promote awareness and appreciation of local culture and enable the Cebuano to tell his story. It is in line with Rafi's vision of touching people, shaping the future.
Noon sa namin mong nungoy, nagmuro-muro naman sa lagi na.
Dahil kayo parang tuloy ka nakiklaan ko sukat.
Pandemya ba yan? Sa kayo maglaag-laag, tanong?
Wala tuloy pakin ako.
Namang good. Ano lang, ato atag ka sa Gordo Museum na.
Di ba sarado pa sila?
Ambling na, uy. Virtually. Ay, no pang load, be. Huwag mo kalimut good nga nisaad ko ni maglaag last year, but kanilang sa for now, ha? Pinaagi sa Casa Gordo Museum virtual tour, makasuway tag guided tours lod sa balay ug napagay mga pagdrama sa maayong pamatasan sa una sa mga Subuanon.
Hala kalay siya good anak, bi. Basin mahal sa kayo na, bi ha? Abli na ba yung tanggap sa?
Hello, B. Afford na kayo ni B. Uy, only the best for you.
Hala wala tayo sila admission fee. Hala ato kong nasuwayan, bi.
So, hey, good! Pwede na mo bisita sa Casa Gordo gamit imong mga smartphone, iPhone, Android phone, aside sa laptop or desktop.
Hala ingon na nagidi sila ka accessible. Hala kasayon na di mo suri sa Casa Gordo Museum, uy.
Snake, may mata na, uy! Kanya, kumusta man yung experience sa Casa Gordo Museum virtual tour?
Nindot kay akong feeling roy kay mura jud kog naa sa sulod sa museum. Og daghan sad kog nakatunan roy bahin sa balay roy kultura og kabilin sa atong mga Subuanong katigulangan. O basta nindot kaayo og ako po nang i-share ang link sa virtual tour nila Lester, Japet, James ug Jasper ug sa akong mga mangod og family og para ginistan.
So, ay mo paglangan?
O i-check na ninyo ang website sa casagorordomuseum.org. Aron ma-experience ninyo ang among na-experience.
Most loving Father, you have brought us to the beginning of a new day.
As our eyes open to the morning light, our mouths praise your beauty and goodness in the splendor and design of your creation.
We accept the renewed gift of life and grace with gratitude.
We offer you our every thought, word, and act today, and pray that it be in accordance with your will and in furtherance of your glory.
Make us instruments of your presence to others.
Use our minds to understand the big picture, our hearts full of passion and purpose, and our hands to build partnerships.
Let us be adequate persons to become architects of change and fulfill our promise of elevating lives of communities and people we serve.
When evening comes, gather us again, safe under the shelter of your wings, to rest confirmed in your love.
And with the assurance that with your help, we have taken one more step towards a better world.
Amen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and maayong hapon sa tanan. We are back this afternoon for another episode of Casa Gordo Museum Talk online series. Ako di ay si Rave, and I'll be your host for today. I am the program officer for events of Casa Gordo Museum. For those of you who'd like to watch our previous talks, they are still available in our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. If you'd like to ask questions, by the way, during the talk, you can post them in Facebook, and we will pick some of them for our Q&A portion later on. Now, the CGM Talk online series is one of the many programs of the Culture and Heritage Unit of the Ramon Aboitiz Foundation Incorporated that promotes Filipino and Cebuano identity and pride of place. In celebration of October as Museum and Galleries Month, Casa Gordo Museum offers this talk entitled Color as Expression in Philippine Architecture. Our speaker this afternoon is one of the Philippines' respected restoration architects, specializing in conservation of built heritage. He is a lecturer at the Cultural Heritage Studies program of UST Graduate School, a member of the National Committee on Museums and Sites of NCCA, and currently heads the Subcommission of Cultural Heritage of NCCA. Please welcome our speaker this afternoon, Architect Michael Manalo.
Hi, thanks Rave, and good afternoon to everybody. And thanks to Casa Gordo and to Rafi for the invitation. I really miss going to Cebu, and this is probably the closest that I can be to Casa Gordo in Cebu. You know. Okay, so without further ado, I'll begin. So can we have the first slide, please, Rave? So color. Everybody knows about color, no? But what exactly is it about color that fascinates us or doesn't fascinate us? Next slide, please. Cultures always have color, no? So there's always a kind of expression that a culture would use color for. So if you look at your screens, this is well, somebody had made this. This is how different cultures would apply color. So you would have, for example, it says there A, B, C, D up to J. So those are different cultures, different world cultures. Some of them in general, some of them very particular. And then you would have in the numbers how those different cultures would express, for example, anger, balance, beauty, uh, sometimes cruelty or danger or health. So you would have a color for almost everything within a specific culture. So maybe later on you would ask yourselves, I wonder how I would personally um, using color personally express anger, right? Is it red? Is it yellow? Or maybe how would I project serenity through color, right? Some of us would associate colors now with politics. So different politicians would have their own colors, no? So color is something visual. So that is why a lot of people would use color to express themselves, no? And as a culture, a lot of cultures would use color to express themselves. Next slide, please. So for this lecture today, just some guide questions. Is color present or is color absent, right? Are there certain periods associated with the presence or absence of color? So later on, we'll see that, right? And then, is there color in Philippine architecture from the colonial period? So we'll delve into colonial, no? We can't also do the whole gamut of color chromatic expression because that will take a whole semester probably, no? And then what is the state of color in terms of colonial architecture here in the Philippines? So those are just some guide questions. Next slide, please. Let's go to color in antiquity. Why do we have to see this? Because we are the combination of East and West here in the Philippines. So here you have Greece. This is, of course, a lot of you who are students of architecture would know this as the Parthenon. And a lot of people would see the Parthenon as gleaming white. No, it's white marble. Next slide, please. So when people had visited the Parthenon for the first time during the probably the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, they would see something which was white. Next slide, please. But upon further investigation, they discovered that it had color, no? Because the ancient Greeks also expressed themselves not only in the superb carvings, but also that these carvings would have color. Next slide, please. So here you would have a frieze. On the leftmost part, you would have the uncolored portion, and then on the right and above, you would have how color could have been rendered. So this is based on scientific investigations of these friezes, no, that come from Parthenon. So you can see pattern, both pattern and color, no, and figures. Next slide, please. So this is probably what that frieze would have looked like when it was installed inside the Parthenon. So you could imagine that the Parthenon wasn't really just white, it was very much colored. Next slide, please. And then you would have some remnants of color also from Greek statuary. This isn't particularly from the Parthenon, but you can see how the sleeve of this particular subject, also in white marble, exhibits, next slide please, exhibits color, right? So here we have a detail of that, and you can see also minute details, the pattern, and also the colors that evoke the textiles of that day. Next slide, please. And then moving on in Rome, it's the same. So when everybody had rediscovered Rome, they saw all of this white marble, right? standing in front of them, whether in a ruined state or in a semi-ruined state. So when the reconstructions started, well, you would start reconstructing, of course, from drawings, right? So when they started drawing these, they started drawing them all in white. So it's the same as when they had rediscovered the ruins in ancient Greece, right? So same thing happened in ancient Rome. Next slide, please. When things got reconstructed in drawings or in models, they were all rendered in white, right? Because that is how they found these pieces of marble. But next slide, please. You would have again all of these analyses of all of these remnants, and a lot of them would exhibit color. So this is in one of the fora in the Forum Romanum in Rome, right? This is the Forum of Augustus. So you can see that a lot of it was colored, especially the figurative sculpture. Next slide, please. So this is in another part of the forum. So you can also see it reconstructed in full color. And next slide, please. And this is one of the, sorry, next slide, please. There you go. So this is one of the statues that was found in ancient Rome of Julius Caesar. And you can see the one that is exhibited in the museum versus another copy that had all of this polychrome. No? So polychrome meaning different colors, no, that are applied onto the statuary. So they weren't really just white. So upon minute investigation, you would find bits and pieces of color still lodged in the crevices of all of these statues and all of these architectural monuments, and they would now give you an idea of what the colors were. So next slide, please. Of course, we all know that Rome was sacked, the barbarians had triumphed, and the Western world was plunged into the Middle Ages. So during the Middle Ages, of course, the maximum expression of architecture was the Gothic cathedral. And here you have one of those Gothic cathedrals in all its majesty. This is in Amiens in France. So you can see it. It's also all in kind of like a light gray stone, no? But of course, there would always still be color. Next slide, please. So in the next slide, you would have the main door, the main portal to the cathedral in Amiens. And on the left side, you would see it as it appears today. But a lot of the restorers and the conservation technicians had looked into the stones, and what they found were, again, references of color, so that every year what they would do, they didn't put back the color like you see in the right side. This isn't a reconstruction. This isn't how you see it now. You'll still see the left side today. No, it's still light gray, no, or beige. But once a year they have a light and sound show wherein they project the original colors onto the facade of the Cathedral of Amiens. So this is how the Westworks or the Western facade would look like. So you would see all of this fascinating color rendered on the stone, right? So it's difficult to put back this color because a lot of people nowadays would say, wait a minute, but we already know a Gothic cathedral to be devoid of color. So a lot of people would share that memory, no, of a Gothic cathedral devoid of color, so much that something, if something happens, such different people today. Next slide, please. So you would see all of the portals of the western facade all lit up. This is once a year. The Sonnet Lumiere show, the sound, light and sound show in Amiens in France. Next slide, please. So after the Middle Ages, you would have a period of rediscovery. This is the Renaissance, and on your screens is the first page of the treatise of Vitruvius. So we all know that the discovery of Vitruvius's treatise in architecture is what really spawned this entire rediscovery of classical architecture in the Western world, beginning in Italy. Next slide, please. So you would have products such as, of course, the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, so the maximum expression of the Renaissance, and also bits and pieces of the Mannerist style and the Baroque also there. No? But you would see it devoid of color. There's no color, correct? So this is how they found the old Roman ruins back then. And of course, leafing through the pages of Vitruvius, you would not read of color. You would only see either drawing or maybe descriptions of buildings. So there's no mention of color in the entire treatise. And also, when they went to the Forum Romanum and saw the ruins of the Forum, they initially didn't find any color. So this is how they interpreted everything. This is how they interpreted classical architecture at the time. Next slide, please. So even sculpture would be all in white. This is the Ecstasy of Santa Teresa, and this is by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. So this is also in Rome. Ironically, a lot of Roman sculpture from antiquity, right, to putting color onto their subjects, right? So this would be 500 or 1,000 years before that, unfinished. But for the people of the Renaissance and the Baroque, this is how it should have been, right? This is their expression, no? It's devoid of color. Next slide, please. So we go now to Spain, and these are what they call mocarabes, no? So these are plaster works, so geometric plaster works, and this is in the Alhambra in Spain. So you would see that not only was there color, but there was also gold that was applied to the plasterwork, as evidenced by the residues of gold right there. Next slide, please. So this is how it would look like in a general view. So you would have some parts that were colored, and then some parts that look like they are faded already. So a lot of people, when they find these monuments and they see that, oh, there's no color, they would already deduce that there was not any color in any of these monuments until you find pieces like this, right? And then you begin to suspect, wait a minute, if this part is colored and the other part isn't, then something must be done about it. Maybe a more in-depth study should there is an abundance of color in these monuments. Next slide, please. So in Spain also, this is the cathedral in Granada. You can see the cathedral seemingly devoid of color, but once upon a time with color. But you can see the buildings flanking it all with color. So one building to the left is ochre and green, and another building on your right is pink and red. Next slide, please. So this is another building in Spain. This is in the monastery of Montserrat outside of Barcelona, and you can see how they use color not just to give you that impression that a building is colored, but they also use it to render architectural features. So if you zoom a little bit on the what seems to be third and fourth floors, would be all of those beautiful Solomonic columns, but all rendered in stucco and all in that color, right? Next slide, please. And then we go to the New World. Of course, we know that Spain had also launched expeditions to the Americas and eventually to the Philippines. And this is the kind of chromatic expression that was produced. Of course, you have the meeting of not just two cultures, but different cultures, because in Latin America there are so many different indigenous cultures. But here we are showing a church in Puebla, in Mexico, and this is the Church of San Francisco Acatepec, and you see it rendered in tile. So all of these are tile, so they're either clay tiles or ceramic tiles that are baked on site, right? And put together to produce this ensemble. So you have sort of like a mosaic of color. This is the exterior of San Francisco Acatepec, but the next slide would give you the interior view, not of this particular church, but another church nearby, Santa Maria Tonancintla. Next slide, please. So these two churches are in the very indigenous areas outside of the Baroque city of Puebla in Mexico. So you can see an abundance of colors still, but there would also be that reference to very colonial, well, maybe a colonial appetite for gold. So you can see the what seems to be the main retablo, but you can't actually see the main retablo because everything sort of like coalesces into one entire scenery, right? So it's very difficult to distinguish where the posts are or where the niches are. Everything is just coalescing into one giant canvas. But you can see a lot of color. Again, this is indigenous expression, Mexican indigenous expression, but also you can see gold, a lot of gold, which would allude to very Spanish tradition. Next slide, please. The next slide would give a glimpse of that Spanish part. So this is the Capilla del Rosario in Puebla itself. So this is already in a very Hispanic city. No? Puebla is sort of like the second city of Mexico after Mexico City itself. So here you have more of gold than polychrome, right? So it's very hard to see color in this. So all you see is the yellowness of that gold, right? So this is a very Hispanic thing, right? So next slide, please. From there we go across to here. So we're home, and what are we looking at? We're looking at indigenous architecture from the Philippines. This is in Mindanao. This is a Maranao, Torogan. So if you zoom in, if your screens are capable of zooming in, you can take a look at all of these okir carvings, and you can find color, right? So all of these are colored, and each color would mean something. We're not going to go into the meaning of color. We're just really looking at the presence of color in this lecture, because the meaning of color, as I said, would beget another semester's worth of lectures. So you can see that there is actually color, and even on the boards that make up the wall, uh, they used to have color also. So in this case, those are polychrome. Next slide, please. So you now have textile also. So this is textile from Mindanao, and you can see sort of like an explosion of color. And in the next slide, please, you would have an application of all of these wonderful textiles from Mindanao in an interior. Of course, this is set up as a museum, so it's not very authentic to how a house would used to look. But the application of textile was always meant to enliven the interiors of an otherwise brown interior of a house, right, in Mindanao. So you can see here the application of all of these textiles, whether as bands or as big spreads of textile, right, on the walls and on the ceilings. Next slide. You can also see that in another room in that same museum. So when you go up the stairs, this is one of the sleeping quarters. So you can see the textiles, the embroideries, and also I spy something that looks like a woven mat, a banig, as they call it in Tagalog. Next slide, please. So woven mats are also very popular in the Philippines simply because this is what we use for sleeping in the pre-colonial times and also during the colonial times. So this is a staple in a Filipino house, right? But here you have an expression of color. We really don't know these mats are from Samar, from Basay and Samar, but we really don't know how the patterns and the colors had come about, whether they came during the colonial period or there was a pre-colonial tradition of using color. So this is what we actually don't know yet. So it's something that we have to study. Next slide, please. And maybe when we do our, next slide, please. So maybe when we do our study of color in the Philippines, we should also be looking into documents, right? So this is coming from the Boxer Codex, and this may be one of the best sources that depict how pre-colonial Filipinos look like. And you can see that they did wear color on them, but of course the conquistadors and the people with them, for example, the people who made this codex, they were more fascinated with the gold, actually. So you can see how the gold is rendered, and there is just a profusion of gold. You have here on the left side, it says Naturales Tagalos. No? So these are from the Tagalog area. And then I think the one on the right are from the Visayas. It's a couple from the Visayas. Next slide, please. So did this polychrome, next slide, there you go. Did this polychromy survive? Did all of these expressions from pre-colonial Philippines survive well into the colonial period? Well, your guess is as good as mine, and I would say that it did. So we'll be seeing a couple of examples of how color had survived into the colonial period. So this is the Inchausti house. Next slide, please. This used to be in the Ermita Malate area of Manila. And as you can see, the house was a very stately house. It's now gone. This is a victim of the war also. And you can see that this very stately mansion was recessed from the street, and then it was separated by this very, very beautiful gate, right, and fence. Next slide, please. The next slide would show you that the house is actually in a style called the Neo-Mudéjar. So there was a style in Spain that was prevalent from the 13th to about the 14th up to the 15th century up to the 16th, 17th centuries. This is the Mudéjar style, and the Mudéjar style would take a lot from the Muslim styles that sort of survived from the time that parts of Spain were actually settled by the Moors, right? So when Spain became a Catholic country, the ones who stayed, right, were the artisans and the ones who were working on the buildings of Catholic Spain. And they produced this style called the Mudéjar. So it marries Muslim and Christian styles together, fusing it into one. And in the 19th century, it was revived. So here we see one of the fruits of that revival, the Inchausti house, is neo-mudéjar in style. Um, Next slide, please. So we can probably appreciate some examples outside of the Philippines, just to see how people would use color on these neo-mudéjar examples of architecture. So you can see here a profusion of color again. It's a very oriental style. It's a very exotic style that enjoyed popularity almost all across the globe, actually. So you will still find examples here in the Philippines of the neo-mudéjar style, but nothing as polychromed as this. And if we were seeing that photo in the Inchausti house, it's all in black and white, so we can't really see the colors. Next slide, please. So in the next slide is the saguan, or the ground floor of the Inchausti house. So you can see all these beautiful pillars, sort of evoking the Alhambra in Granada in Spain. But then you would have it all bathed not in sunlight but in shadow, because here in the Philippines we need more shadow than sunlight because sunlight is just too harsh, actually. So houses were really meant to produce more shadows. Next slide, please. So here we have the interior of the ground floor. So you know that this is already later in the Spanish colonial period, and you know that this is a city house because the ground floor is already being used. In this case, it is some sort of receiving area in the ground floor. Next slide, please. So you can see black and white marble, you can see beautiful wicker chairs, but you can also spy that the ceilings and the walls have all of these beautifully painted borders and panels, right? So all of these would have had color. And these painted panels and ceilings would also make their way into the second floor. Next slide, please. So in the second floor, you would now see how this neo-mudéjar style is sort of married with a rather French style of interiors, right? Because also in the 19th century, a lot of societies looked to the French style of interiors being one of the most sophisticated styles that one could have in one's home. So here you have an example of that. So this is the Inchausti house. Next slide, please. Just for you to be able to probably picture how those painted panels could have looked. This is in the storage, the bodega of a well-known company in Paris that specializes in boiseries. They call it boiseries. So these are panelings, but boiseries would also have painted panels, right? So you can see the painted panels here. And next slide. You can see how it is when they are installed. So it sort of evokes how the Inchausti house would have looked like. It's just that we only know it in photos and in black and white photos. Next slide, please. So this is the dining room of that same house. And it's interesting when you take a look at the dining room and compare it to that other very elegant receiving room. And you would see that the dining room is actually has less decor in it, and the ceiling, of course, is painted, but the walls aren't as magnificently painted as the other room. Maybe because this is one of the more personal spaces for a family, even up to now. All of us would rather really hang out in the dining room and talk and eat while talking to family or friends. So this is a space that is more down to earth. It is more familiar. Next slide, please. So we go now to another house in Manila, the Lawton home. Next slide. So the Lawton home was actually located next to the Pasig River, and you can see in the foreground it does have that little little wharf where the boat can moor. Next slide, please. But inside, you find also that sort of same flavor as the Inchausti house. But the Lotan house is much older than the Chausti house by probably 20 years or so. So based on the style and even in the style of the wrought iron, you can see it. But you can see the floor, you have a profusion of pattern, and you can also see that it has plant stands that were imported from China. And these plant stands would normally have color, either green, blue, or shades of red. Next slide, please. So when you go upstairs, this is the first thing that you see. The coat of arms of Spain is now down on the floor. It's war booty because the Americans had just captured the Philippines at this time, right? And so you would have also as part of the decor rifles and stuff, right? Stuff associated with fighting. But you can also see the Oriental plant stands still there. But what is interesting is that if you look at the walls, you actually don't see any blank spaces. So the walls actually had wallpaper, right? So probably the blank space would be the pilaster. The pilaster, but that would be reeded, so it wouldn't really be considered blank. And then you would again have like wallpaper walls. And then what else do we have? We have the carved chairs. You would have a round table that would have been imported from Canton, and then you would have a French mirror hanging there, and probably the chandelier would also be French. So you're looking at houses all that already show that mix of cultures. So remember when we were looking earlier at Western architecture, this Western architecture would also flow into our architecture. And when we crossed the Pacific and we looked at Eastern architecture in the Philippines, that sensibility would also be blended into our houses, into different structures that were made during the colonial period. Next slide, please. So here you have a view of the living room of the Lawton house. And you would see a beautiful French chandelier, and in the background, a beautiful French mirror. And then all of the furniture, of course, made in the ateliers of Manila. And next slide, please. Here you can spy a ceiling and also have that same wallpaper, but the frieze, the entablature on top of on the upper part of the wall would have been painted to mimic stone, maybe marble, right? Next slide, please. So let's look at some Philippine churches. Did they have color? Of course, they had color. Next slide, please. So this one is in the town of Pasig, here in Manila. Next slide, please. Upon closer inspection, you could spy color, right? So you would have a band that was carved into the corner, right? Just to simulate a rope. And you would have alternating red and white on this rope or that band. Next slide. But underneath that beam, we found this. And when we were looking through it, we asked for some water and we cleaned it. And next slide, please. It was all gold leaf. So this, when we looked at the documents pertaining to Pasig Church, this was one of the proofs that would say that Pasig Church was actually one of the wealthier parishes that actually lent money to other parishes, and the evidence is this, what we see on the screen, very sumptuous interiors. So you can imagine you could have you could have had like two pilasters, all in gold, right? Gold leaf, and then when you looked at the ceiling, it would be red, right? So maybe a bit of an Oriental sensibility, but I think we need to do more research just to uncover what exactly the color scheme was. Next slide, please. So we look at documents just to look at the colors that they had used. So these are part of documents from the late 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, and on the bottom part of your screen, you would see the colors there. So what I see is Azul de Prusia, Prussian blue, right? And then some of the materials that they would use, like gesso, right? So they would use that on the buildings, and they would use colors such as Prussian blue, yellows, greens, etc. Next slide, please. So these are from Bohol, particularly the Church of Lobok. When the earthquake of 2013 struck, a team was fielded out, and behind the retablo, you find some images rendered in plaster. So the angel that you see and the image of Saint Ignatius that you see, they're all rendered in plaster. But the plaster was tinted, right? So it was tinted with color. So all of this color is integral to the plaster, which is something that we don't normally see. We see plaster and then plaster that's painted over, but plaster where color is mixed into the lime is very, very rare. So this is a very rare piece of architectural decoration. Next slide, please. This is in the sacristy in Dimiao. Now, caution. On the left side, you see green. This isn't the color. So green is not the color. Green is only the effect of moisture. So you do have already some kind of moss or algae growing on the walls. So this isn't the color. The color is actually the one on the left, on the right side. So you see ochres, you see some sort of burnt sienna, and a little bit of green, actually. So when we did our chromatic studies, we used a color meter. It's available. It's by Pantone, and it gives you the Pantone code. So the numbers that you see are the Pantone codes: 17-VV6 for that sort of burnt sienna, and then 171047 for the ochre, and sort of like a brown that's 190608. So these are some of the colors that we had found on the walls. But if you look closely, you would find line drawings that resemble branches and leaves. So it's a very, very interesting. Word of caution, all of these churches had been restored after the earthquake, and sadly, we've actually lost this one, and we've actually also lost the figure of Saint Ignatius. What about in the north? An Ilocano example. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. So these are the Pantone colors. Those are the Pantone colors that I was talking about. Next slide. So an Ilocano example. Next slide. So if you do a Google search of an Ilocano house interior, this is actually what you're going to get. It's really more of whites, browns, beiges, wood, maybe some brick, but not a lot of color, actually, not a lot of color. So it's funny when we go to the next slide. Next slide, please. This is a house in Vigan. So you see the first photo on the upper left. uh, everything used to be covered with this paint, right? A light green paint. But we started peeling off the paint, and it revealed uh, a floral decoration that was painted using oil, right? So it's like an oil painting on a wall, and the motif is based on flowers. So this is in one house in Vigan. Next slide, please. The next slide is from a different house in Vigan. So this is from the Lazo house. So you see a beautifully executed cartouche. We suspect that this is already from the early 20th century. And you have two bands of aquamarine going behind that cartouche. Next slide. And you see a beautiful painted wainscoting on top of that. It's sort of like a neo-rococo motif. Next slide, please. So that's just a detail of that painted band in neo-rococo. Next slide. But what's interesting is when you enter the main door, you have above the main door two leaves, right? The leaf on the left side is green, the leaf on the right side is brown. And then you have a lovely band of what looks like butterflies. And then above that would already be the moldings of the ceiling. And all of these moldings and the entire ceiling is of pressed metal. Now, this is a house that has a story painted onto it. So maybe we'll start with the side of the green leaf. Next slide, please. So next to that green leaf is this mural. We can take a close-up view. Next slide, please. So you can see in the next slide, you have part of that mural on the bottom. Part of that mural is a crescent moon and two birds playing. And then you have a beautiful bouquet. It's funny. It has graffiti and says, "I love you, Ma," from Pa. I guess they also wanted to put a dialogue to the two birds. No? So this is really actually a lovely painting. No? So next to it, next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I think we jumped. Oh, oh, sorry. Can you go to the slide before? There you go. So if you look at the entire composition, you see a major painting on the upper left, and it shows you a pathway, a path surrounded by lush greenery. And then on the bottom right, you would have that crescent moon and the two birds playing with each other. Next slide, please. We can jump 2 slides now. So on a wall on that side, you would have a door. And above the door, you would have this image. Next slide, please. So you'd have two hearts strewn together, right? And then it would have an arrow linking them also together and a bow. And then that beautiful green ribbon. So it's all rendered sort of like it's an allegory for love, right? So this entire side is talking about love. It's talking about abundance. It's talking about probably the prime of somebody's life. Now, let's go to the next slide. Let's see what the other side is all about. So you see on the left side of your screen, upper left, you would have that brown leaf, right? And then here you would see that composition. Again, major painting and then crescent. Next slide. So if we look at that crescent, now the major painting, of course, looks a little forlorn. It's the afternoon. Everything is like sort of like at the period of sunset, right? And then here on the crescent, what do you see? You have you have a nest, and then you have eggs that have already been cracked, so the eggs have hatched. And then where are the two birds? The two birds are actually separated from each other. So um, something is not at all right. Right? Next slide, please. And then when we go to another part of that room, the door on that side, uh, let's take a look at the allegory on top of the door. Next slide, please. So the allegory on top of the door is Cupid, and you would see Cupid, you were seeing Cupid crying, and you would see one of Cupid's wings already torn from Cupid, right? So this is probably about love lost, but not just love lost. This is already probably saying something about the twilight of one's life. So it's very interesting how all of this painting, as how all of this ornament and how all of this color is used to convey stories. Um, it it was told to me when I was doing research on this house that there is oral history that comes from the family that owns it. The Lazo family has in its oral history something like a Frenchman that had made his way into Vigan and had courted one of the daughters of the owner of the house. Um, I don't think they ended up together. So he had expressed himself in all of these paintings. Medyo mabait pa siya, di ba? Pining pa niya yung bahay. Na-busted na nga siya. Next slide, please. So let's look at the source of all of this color and all of this expression. Color in 1825. This is actually coming from a folio that was found in the library of the Royal Palace in Madrid. Next slide, please. And this folio shows the arrival in 1825 of the portrait of the King of Spain. So, of course, Spain was too far for the monarch to travel to the Philippines. No? So he couldn't make it. He sent his portrait. But here you can see it on a carriage, right? Would have been pulled by horses, and the carriage is decked up in all of this color and all of these carvings. Next slide, please. He actually had an alternate carriage. No, this is the side view of that carriage. So they really documented this event very, very well. The folio has a lot of these watercolor drawings. So here you see the side elevation of that carriage. Next slide, please. Here you have an alternate carriage for the portrait, right? So it's different, but it's still rendered in all of these colors. What are the colors that you're seeing? You're seeing reds, you're seeing pink, you're seeing greens, you're seeing violets, right? So it's really a lot of color, actually. Next slide, please. So they also erected like these temporary fences in the parks and all of these beautiful columns in the parks of Manila at that time. And all of them were colored, and you can see the colors that they were using were based on ochres and pinks. Next slide, please. It also shows you how the residences of the people of Manila looked like at that time. So sometimes you would have residences that could have had all of this white and then painted with some color, right? So here you would see how they would actually put color. It's through the drapery. So they would use the drapery, they would use textile in order to have color in the composition of the facades of their houses. Next slide, please. But you have buildings such as this one. Next slide. So you would have buildings such as this one. This was the Palace of the Governor General, and it was in full color. I don't know how we would actually see this building if it had been standing up to this very day. And we're going to see it in blue and ochre. So it could be an assault to our senses today, but in that day, this was fashionable. Blue and ochre and reds and pinks. It was very fashionable. Next slide. So you would see all of that color being used in other houses also in Manila during this period. So you'd see this house. This is the house of a high-ranking official. This one would already be in the like Phil-Hispanic style because it would already have that projecting volada. But you would see that it's painted. So it's painted in, again, ochre is the base, and then you would have greens, and then you would have blues and reds and pinks, etc. Next slide, please. Inside the Ayuntamiento or City Hall of Manila, this is the ballroom, and the portrait was installed here for a couple of hours. So you would see it, you'd see all the beautiful French chandeliers, but you would also see the drapery in either a pink or a red, but then you'd also have blues and ochres painted onto the walls. Next slide, please. That's a detail just to show you in close-up how the walls would have looked like, and it would also have had pilasters that were rendered in green. Next slide. These come from an album, and it was labeled Malacanang Palace, but we don't know if it's actually Malacanang Palace. Next slide, please. Wow, this is psychedelic. But probably the painter or the artist wasn't so adept at making interior perspectives because probably he wasn't trained to do so. So this is his attempt to make an interior perspective. But what we can see is color and pattern, greens and whites, and all these swirling patterns that probably would denote either a painted wall or a wall with wallpaper. Next slide, please. So we go to the main drawing room where the portrait of the reigning monarch was placed. And you would also see the walls either painted or with wallpaper. Next slide, please. That stately drawing room would be interpreted by other artists to look like this. Very lofty, very regal. It looked like it had 20-foot high ceilings and a profusion of chandeliers. Next slide, please. But in truth, next slide, the room, sorry, next slide, please. There you go. Oh, sorry, can you go back one slide, please? Back, there you go. So that room, so that's the lithograph, right? 20-foot high ceilings. And then we go to the next slide. That's actually the room. So artists would tend to exaggerate sometimes, but you can see that, oh, yes, the French mirrors are there, and the chandeliers had been changed. Next slide, please. So brown, white, brick, and stone. So that's the prevalent idea of how an old house or an old church would be colored in this very day. Next slide, please. So if you do a Google search of old houses, of Bahay na Bato, that's what's going to come out. So it's all brown, it's all white, it's all gray. So it's really very rustic if you really think about it. But again, we saw the white sculptures from the Baroque and what a sculptor from antiquity would think about it. He would think that it would be unfinished. So a lot of the original builders, if they saw these houses, they would have thought, oh, wow, why are they all unfinished, right? I can see the stones, I can see the wood, I can see the building materials. Why is it like that? Next slide, please. So this is sort of like a interpretation, an interpretation of the Marcos house in Batak, in Ilocos Norte. So uh, that time, it was the time when government actually used culture, particularly architecture, to project the national identity. And part of it was creating a string of these recreations of Bahay na Bato. So you can see the recreation and you can see that the wood is apparent, right? You can see the wood and the color of the wood, and everything else would be white or orange, the color of brick. So that would be the prevalent architectural language at this time. Next slide, please. So you would have the house of the leading architect of that time. You would have the house of the leading architect of that time, Leandro Locsin. Here, there you go. This is the interior of the house of Leandro Locsin. And of course, we all know that the national artist for architecture, Lindy Locsin, was one of the favorites of that government, right? So this is his interpretation of a Filipino interior. And of course, we see browns and grays and maybe a sprinkling of brick. Next slide, please. Also from this era, a little younger than Leandro Locsin, is Francisco Mañosa, Bobby Mañosa. So this is the interior of his house. But if you look at it, except for the green carpet, everything would also be brown and white and wood, right? So this is actually the aesthetic that is being proposed to render a Filipino house. So at this point in time, color in a Filipino house would be relegated to ornament. Like, for example, the tapestry by Federico Aguilar Alguaz that's hanging on the wall, or maybe even the very carpet on the floor. Next slide, please. This is a resort that he had created, Escaya, and you would see that it actually is the same aesthetic. It's brown and white. Wood is apparent, and it's very beautiful. But the absence of color is very apparent. You would only have color in some of the pillows and in an accent in bed, right? Next slide, please. So it wouldn't be surprising if their houses that were restored during that period and they ended up without color. So this is the Gaston House in Silay, Negros Occidental. This is already a museum, but you can see how even the cement walls are left as cement. So this is an aesthetic that wouldn't actually really have existed at the time that the house was built. All of this would have been painted. The cement wouldn't have been seen. The red oxide of the grills would have been painted with another color, and of course, all of that wood would also have been painted. Next slide, please. So, what about in Cebu? Next slide, please. So this is already the tail end of our discussion. So of course we have all of the beautiful painted ceilings of Cebu, and from poster you have already seen the ceiling of Karkar Church, which appears on the left side of your screen, and then Sibonga Church on the right side of your screen by Ray Francia. And then next slide, please. This is the interior of the convento of Karkar. Here you see all of this beautiful expression and color, and not to mention the floors are also of different shades of brown, right? So you'd have actually at least 3 shades of brown on the floor and a profusion of color on the walls and on the ceilings. Next slide, please. So the same thing happens in the foyer when you go up the stairs. So it's the same thing. You have this trompe-l'oeil ceiling that has all of this color, and also the painted panels on the walls. So in fact, Cebu is actually conserving much more color than probably other parts of the Philippines if you think about conservation of historic architecture. Next slide, please. Some of the houses of Karkar, this is from a good friend of ours, Jerry Alfafara's house, is his family house. You can see that there is some green left on the ceilings, but you can also see on the walls there are remnants of wallpaper. So the wallpaper, some of it is still intact. Next slide, please. You can see more of the wallpaper on the background, and you can see the Chinese planters, this one in blue, right, in the background also. Next slide, please. And here I would leave you with a couple of images from Argao. So this is a photo of the retablo of Argao from the 1970s. And you can see all this magnificent color, but it is painted in a style called estofado. No? We all know estofado as a dish, but estofado is also a style of painting. So in the estofado style of painting, you first put the gold on, and then you paint on top of the gold. But then the real estofado painting would have actually the color first, and then the gold put on later. And then all of that would be pricked, and those small pricks would then reveal the color from underneath. But this one has the gold on first, and then color was put afterwards. So here you have it from the 1970s, and then in the next slide, you would have a photo of it from the early 2000s. Now, the gold leaf was restored, I think, in this time. But you still have the polychromy, right? The colors still sort of intact. It's just that we've already lost some color in the niches, right? Because in the photo before this, you actually had color in the niches, and now they're gone, right? The patterns are gone. So we're losing some of the patterns, some of the color, but the major ones on the drapery that's carved, and on the pillars, and on the saints themselves, on the angels themselves, are still there. Next slide, please. Today, this is how we know. This is how we know Argao. So this is that same retablo, and there's no more color. It's really all just gold. So even the archangels are in gold, and everything else is gold and off-white. So this makes you wonder, what happens then after this? Will generations after know Argao to have just a golden altar without color, right? And that the expression is only based on gold. Next slide, please. We go back to the guide questions. Is color present? Of course. Are certain, sorry, can we go to the next slide? Are certain periods associated with the presence of or absence of color? That we saw. We saw how color would peak in use, and we saw how color would wane in use, right? Is there color in Philippine architecture from the colonial period? Of course. Now, what is the state of color in terms of colonial architecture? That is what we're looking at now. So you have places where color is still being celebrated as an integral part of architecture, but then you also have color being erased from colonial architecture. We're not saying that it is good or it is bad, but we are also saying that in terms of memory, we are losing some of that memory, some of those records of the expression through color in architecture. But we are also keeping track of what the fashion is in terms of color and the use of color. So it's very interesting to see this progression, or some people would say it's actually a regression. Uh, um, really depends on who you're talking to. Next slide, please. So is it fashion? Of course, everything is really fashion. So now the fashion probably is no color. But then we will come to a time again when we need ornament, we need color, we need all of this expression. Uh, Next slide. Yes, but we have to preserve color. Why? Because, as I was telling you earlier, it is part of that cultural expression, right? And it is part of that memory. So when we lose all of these colors, we then lose part of that memory unless it's documented, right? Next slide, please. I think this is the last slide. So again, we look at that chart, colors in culture. Imagine having all of these colors one by one fading out, either becoming black, white, or maybe gold, right? So it just says how we are handling color, and it just says how our cultures and our societies are progressing, right? But right now, this is the uh, this is the chromatic panorama of colors all around the world. But well, I think I personally would enjoy it being this polychrome than everything being black, white, or gold. Next slide, please. And I think that's the last slide. Thank you so much. And we'll go to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sir Nico, for that very detailed and very interesting discussion about colors, basically in architecture. Yeah, for those of you who are watching us, if you'd like to ask questions to Sir Nico, please write them in the comment section below so that we can, before we go to your question, I actually have some questions of my own. Because in previous webinars and talks that we had, there was this topic about fashion that um, there was a clear difference in social status. It was also depicted in the colors of the clothes. Basically, it said that the wealthier you were, the more colors you had in your clothes, and then so for those who are in the lower part of the social status, they would have like a monochromatic outfit. So does this also reflect in houses?
Of course, of course. Everything is expression, as we were talking about earlier. No, so sometimes it's like that, as you had said, Rafe, diba? Na sometimes it's the presence of more colors that would say that mayaman siya, diba? Bahay ng mayaman, something like that. But at certain periods, it's actually the absence of color that would say that somebody has a refined sense of taste, right? So imagine if you were somebody from the 1700s or the early 1800s, you had made your trip to Europe and you had seen the Parthenon and you had seen the ruins in Rome and you had made your tours of the museum, seeing all of the classical sculpture. And you come home and you think everything should be white because that's how I saw it, right? And this is the pinnacle of taste and of elegance of that time. Diba? Take out all of the color. So there are periods that would say that the maximum expression would be the absence of color. But there are periods wherein you would say that it is the profusion of color that would dictate wealth, that would dictate prominence in society. So it's all fashion, right? Sometimes in fashion, there are periods where there's a lot of color, but a lot of times there are periods where, I guess, for followers of women's fashion, the little black dress would have been more appropriate for ladies, right? So sometimes it's that absence of color. Imagine going to a formal black tie event in a fuchsia coat. No, that's unacceptable. That is unacceptable. So you would go to an evening event without color on your body. No, so it's either black or white. So it really depends, no, on the period and on how a society sees color.
Yeah, I think that also explains why most of the houses in this generation, if I've noticed it, if I noticed in like big subdivisions or something like that, the houses are all monochrome. So and then this is another thing that also caught my attention, Sir Nico. The slides that showed the Pasig Church picture with the beams covered in gold leaf, because I think some or most of the students that are watching us right now, they are studying history and they are on the topic of primary sources. So you mentioned earlier that because of that gold leaf, you investigated the documents, which then led to the discovery that Pasig Church was one of the wealthy churches in Manila that even lent money to other churches. Did this type of like discovery happen also during your time here, or during for other? Sorry, this did this discovery also happen with other churches in Luzon or even here in Visayas?
Yeah, it does. Actually, it happened in the reverse. First, the documents were found, right? Not really found, but a lot of researchers would refer to the documents, no? So they would say that Pasig Church was actually lending to Marikina, was lending even to Antipolo. So if you're lending to a major pilgrimage site such as Antipolo, wow, you're very, very wealthy, no? But when you go to Pasig Church today, everything is the same, no? It's all gray. No? So you don't see that wealth manifesting in front of you. But when we found all of that gold leaf, that ornament, then it becomes apparent. No? Then you can say, oh, I can now link it to the record. Diba? That Pasig Church was actually a wealthy parish because it could afford to cover entire surfaces in gold, diba? And this is just one element. It's just the entrance. You're not even discussing what it looked like in the nave, in the retablos, or even in the sacristies. No descriptions kasi. So you're really looking at physical evidence that would substantiate what is in your archival references. So when you link those, then you would find a tangible manifestation of what your archival sources are actually saying. So it's very, very interesting. And it does happen in a lot of other places as well, whether in the same order, right? Archival material first and then discovery after the physical fabric, or in the reverse, diba? Physical fabric first and then archival after.
I see. So, sir, we'll go to, I think we just have one question. Most of the students are now saying thank you in the comment section, but we do have one question from an audience. This is from Miss Judaline Taghoy. Why is that the prominent color used for architecture below is white? What's the reason behind it? I think this was covered already. Um, Earlier. Yeah. So it was, yeah. So let me just um, remove this. On another question, because I have a lot of question in mind. You've mentioned earlier with the example of the Argao Church, the retablo, that now it only has the gold ornaments and gold decorations, but before it used to have a lot of colors and a lot of um, like decorations. Did Is this a clear influence from Spain, or did those colors and decorations of flowers, was it part of influence from, let's say, Mexico? Because, during the galleon trade, we were directly trading with Mexico, and maybe the influence was from there and not directly from Spain. So, would that be like the right assumption?
Yeah, well, actually, Rave, that's interesting. No, you would have, of course, clear influences from both those countries, no, from Mexico and from Spain. But you will also have a contextualization of all of that expression, no. So imagine coming from Spain, you go to Mexico. It's not actually Spanish architecture that you see in Mexico. It's already Spanish architecture that would have been contextualized into a more Mexican setting, no? And then you would have that transplanted to the Philippines. So you are actually looking at a hybrid of a hybrid, no, which is very, very interesting. It's absolutely interesting because you will also have different, not just forms of ornament, but also technologies coming into play. No, so how the carpentry is it very oriental versus a more Western kind of construction? How the colors are, right? What the ornaments actually are, and sometimes you would be very, very surprised to find, like, in that house in Bigan, you'd find actually ornamentation that is local. So you'd have local flora and fauna depicted on the walls and on the ceilings, etc. So the sad part about the Argao retablo is that since it is lost, no, the ornamentation has all been lost. Uh, we're only basing ourselves on photos if we study these ornaments. So we don't know if these ornaments are actually if they're actually Filipino ornaments or local, diba? Local flora and fauna, or they are Mexican or maybe they are Spanish. So this is the value of preserving all of these manifestations, no? In order for us to know more, not about the object but ourselves, no, as a culture, because that's where we see where our roots are coming from. So I don't think I can answer that quite clearly because we're looking at something very particular as the retablos of Argao. But sayang, I hope they're still underneath all of that gold leaf.
Oo nga, indeed, sir. It's really important to preserve, no, these things that we can really see where our identity came from and all that. Now, we have one question, a new question from our audience. Let me just show it to you. Does availability of natural dyes in the Philippines affect the color that they choose in architecture?
Yes, yes, definitely. That's not only for the Philippines, but for the rest of the world. No? So what you find in your backyard is always what you use to build. No? So even for colors, if there have been studies on what plants and stones actually um, parang how these particular plants and stones give us particular colors, no? So if I can actually give you a bibliography of that. So there are studies for the Philippines of the use of plants for color, for coloration. So uh, you're correct, Ricky. It's natural. I wouldn't say dyes, but tinting colors, no, because dyes are particular to cloth. So it's all of these tinting colors. So, like for example, in vegan in the north, uh, there used to be a lot of blue because they traded indigo. hmm So in the 19th century, that was one of the crops that actually made vegan very wealthy. It was indigo. It's blue, diba? And remember one of the slides that I showed you where it said Azul de Prusia, Prussian blue, no? When Prussian blue entered into the market, it is now an artificial tinting color. So it's a powder that was available anywhere in the world. No? So it was being exported and it came to the Philippines. So imagine how that killed the production of indigo in the Philippines, no? And in the rest of the world. It just wiped it out. Diba? Wiped it out dry. So it's things like those that would need attention when we do want to resurrect traditional colors here in the Philippines. No, so actually, it's interesting because um, probably some 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the Coca-Cola Foundation had a project. Um, they were looking for the sources of indigo, right? And they went all the way up to the mountains of Cordilleras here in Luzon. And in Abra, they found a community that was still doing it, and they engaged into a project with that community to produce natural indigo. No? So these things can be replicated also in other parts of the Philippines, where we also have sources of no, source of other tinting colors.
Okay. And then we have one more question here from Daphne. What is the biggest challenge in the preserving architecture in the Philippines?
Wow, biggest challenge is really, gosh, there's a lot eh. There's really a lot. Um, but for us, kasi here in the Philippines, it's a lot of things. But I would say that since we are a very a country that's very vulnerable to natural calamities, that would be one, diba? So that would be one. Another thing would be, of course, if you're thinking of man-made ones, it would be the lack of appreciation, diba? So you would actually not see the value of something in front of you, diba? So if for example you were thinking of the retablo Fargao, uh, if you didn't see the value of the polychrome, of all the painted ornamentation on it, it would be very easy for you to say that, well, the current fashion is to have everything in gold. So that's how it ended. So it's things like that. But again, it really depends on how you look at it. I mean, I see it from that point of view, but other people who are keen observers of fashion and of trends would just see it as part of a trend. And it's also interesting. You get to catalog the different trends that are passing through us. No? So it's going to form part of your documentation where 100 years from now, we're going to see everything and they're going to say, oh, they replaced this ornamentation with gold because at this point in time, it was the fashion. So it's really just another uh, point in in the history of that church.
Okay, and yeah, again, thank you so much, Sir Miko, for having this session with us. We've learned so much from you, and I think majority of our oh, no, most of our students here really are just sending some thank you messages in the comment section.
Thank
Um,
you.
Sorry, I got disconnected there for a second. For the last part, sir, I would like to ask if you have any parting words or message to our audiences for this afternoon.
Uh, Wow, none really. I'm just thinking that well, you just have to know your identity, and knowing your identity would be based on knowing everything that's around you, and don't really hesitate to probe deeper and deeper and deeper into knowing all of these things, because one day it's gonna get covered in gold, probably. So before that happens, at least you can say that, oh, I saw it.
Okay, so again, sir, thank you so much for having this CGM talk with us. And for those of for those of our audiences who'd like to get their e-certificates, you can now answer our feedback form. If, by the way, if you have more questions about this topic, you can still access the video. And I do hope that we can have some of your questions sent to Sir Nico so that he can also answer them later after the live stream na lang siguro. If you have, maybe you're just um, nahihiya na to write down your questions, so you can have them later na lang. Again, Sir Nico, thank you so much, and good afternoon.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks, guys. Have a good week ahead.
So again, for those students who'd like to get their e-certificates, please do not forget to answer our feedback form. The link is already posted in the comment section, and we have more CGM talks for you in the 2022, in the next year. We also have an upcoming activity this Friday, October 29th. That is not with CGM page, but it's in the Gabi sa Kabilin page. We will have a quiz poll. If you'd like to participate as an audience, you can go to the Gabi sa Kabilin page. There's a post there where you can sign up, and we will be giving out prizes. The quiz bowl is not only for the participants, but as audiences, you can also answer questions, and then you can get exciting prizes from the Casa Gorordo Museum shop. Speaking of the shop, we also have um, a number of books that you can actually buy from our shop. I'm not sure if you can see the post. Let me just check. Um, wait. So there you have these books, Argao, Tabunan, Cebu Heritage Frontier. They are all available in our Casa Gorordo Museum shop. You can just send them a message and then ask for the books. We have Argao, In Search of a Usable Past, Tabunan, of course, the Casa Gorordo in Cebu book, Urban Residence in a Philippine Province, the Cebu Heritage Frontier, Argao, Dalaguete, Buluon, Uslob, and the Koga Papers. We just had a very interesting webinar with Sir Jobers Bersales about the Koga Papers. If you'd like to watch that webinar, it is still available in our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. Okay, and that ends our CGM talk for this afternoon. We would like to thank, Casa Gorordo would like to thank all of the viewers on Facebook for joining us today. We hope that we have imparted valuable and interesting information to you guys. I'd also like to thank students from the University of San Carlos and students from the University of San Jose Recoletos for participating in this afternoon's talk. Um, our partners in DepEd who has been supporting us all these months, Casa Gorordo and Gabi sa Kabilin, and our partners in the Araling Panlipunan community of DepEd Region 7. Again, if you'd like to watch more of our videos and content, it is in our Facebook page, and you can also follow us and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So, daghang salamat kaninyong tanan, and we hope to see you again in Casa Gorordo Museum. Maayong hapon.
Adlaw. Welcome to Casa Gorordo Museum.
Cacao in the 21st century. Before, in Lantoy Cave, on the highest mountain in Argao, lived Maria Cacao.
Casa Gorordo Museum is a centerpiece project of the Culture and Heritage Focus Area of the Ramon Aboitiz Foundation Incorporated. The museum's mission is to promote awareness and appreciation of local culture and enable the Cebuano to tell his story. It is in line with Rafi's vision of touching people, shaping the future.
Uy, Bi. Noon sa namin mong nung, uy, nagmuro-muro naman sa lagi na.
Dahil kayo parang tuloy ka nakiklaan kusukan.
Pandemya ba yan? Sa kaya maglaag-laag, tanong?
Da, wala tuloy pakin ako.
Namang good. Ano lang, ato atag ka sa Gordo Museum na.
Di ba sarado pa sila?
Ambli na, uy. Virtually. Ay, no pang load, Bi. Huwag mo kalimut good nga nisaad ko ni maglaag last year, but kanilang sa for now, ha? Pinaagi sa Casa Gordo Museum virtual tour, makasuway tag guided tours lud sa balay ug napagay mga pagdrama sa maayong pamatasan sa una sa mga Subuanon.
Hala kalay siya good anak, Bi. Basin mahal sa kayo na, Bi, ha? Abli na ba yung atang gitsal?
Hello, Bi. Afford ra kay ni Bi. Uy, only the best for you.
Hala, wala tayo sila admission fee. Hala, ato kong nasuwayan, Bi.
So, hey, good! Pwede na mo bisita sa Casa Gordo gamit imong mga smartphone, iPhone, Android phone, aside sa laptop or desktop.
Hala, ingon na nagigit sila ka-accessible? Hala, kasayon na di mo suri sa Casa Gordo Museum, uy.
Snake, may mata na, uy! Kaya, kumusta man yung experience sa Casa Gordo Museum virtual tour?
Nindot kaya akong feeling, Roy, kay mura dyan kong naa sa sulod sa museum. Og daghan sa kong nakatunan, Roy, bahin sa balay, Roy, kultura, og kabilin sa atong mga Subuanong katigulangan. O basta nindot kaayo, og ako po nang i-share ang link sa virtual tour nila Lester, Japet, James, og Jasper, ug sa akong mga mangod, og family, og para ginistanan.
So, ay mo paglangan?
O i-check na ninyo ang website sa casagordomuseum.org. Aron ma-experience ninyo ang among na-experience.